The morning light filtered through the windows of Goodman's Diner with the same golden patience it had shown for 47 years. Warren Buffett pushed through the glass door at exactly 7:23 a.m., his routine as predictable as compound interest, his presence as unassuming as his well-worn khakis. But today, something would shift in the ordinary rhythm of his world, something that would remind him that the most valuable investments are the ones that never appear on any balance sheet. He settled into his usual booth, the red vinyl cracked. From decades of conversation and contemplation, the familiar sounds of the diner wrapped around him like an old coat. The gentle sizzle of eggs on the griddle, the soft murmur of morning conversations, the reassuring clink of coffee cups against saucers. Warren had found solace in this place for years, not because the food was exceptional, though the hash browns held their own, but because here, surrounded by working people starting their day, he could simply be a man with a newspaper and a cup of coffee. "The usual, Mr. Buffett?" called Jenny, the waitress who had been serving him for the better part of a decade. "You know me too well," he replied with a gentle smile, not looking up from the business section. "Cherry Coke and—" His words caught in his throat. Behind the counter, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose hands had known decades of work, stood a woman whose silhouette triggered something deep in his memory. She was arranging pastries in the display case, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her movements graceful despite her years. There was something achingly familiar about the way she held her shoulders, the quiet dignity in her posture. Warren's newspaper lowered slowly. The woman turned, and their eyes met across the diner's humble expanse. Time seemed to fold in on itself, collapsing 40 years into a single heartbeat. "Maria," he whispered, though the word barely escaped his lips. Maria Santos, who had once polished the floors of his first real home, who had prepared countless meals for his young family, who had been there through the sleepless nights when decisions weighed heavy on his mind, stood frozen, a coffee pot trembling slightly in her weathered hands. "Mr. Warren," she said, her voice carrying the same warmth he remembered, though now it was threaded with surprise and something that might have been embarrassment. I didn't expect to see you here." The diner continued its morning symphony. Around them, but for Warren, the world had narrowed to this moment, this recognition, this sudden understanding that life had woven their paths back together in the most unexpected way. He rose from his booth, moving toward the counter with the same measured pace he brought to every important decision. Up close, he could see the lines that time had etched around her eyes, the way her hands showed the honest wear of a lifetime spent in service to others. She was 82 years old. He knew because he had never forgotten her birthday, had always wondered how she was doing in the years since she had left his employ. "Maria," he said again, this time with the certainty of recognition. "What are you doing here?" She straightened, that familiar pride in her bearing that he remembered so well. "Working, Mr. Warren, same as always." The simple answer hit him with unexpected force. Here was a woman who should have been enjoying her retirement, who had given so much of herself to caring for others, still working at an age when rest should have been her reward. "But Maria," he said gently, "you must be 82 this past October," she finished for him, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You always did remember my birthday." Warren felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that went deeper than mere surprise. This wasn't just a chance encounter. This was a reckoning with his own values, his own understanding of what it meant to truly take care of the people who had taken care of him. "Sit with me," he said, gesturing toward his booth. "Please, just for a moment." Maria glanced nervously toward the kitchen, where her manager was visible through the service window. "I'm working, Mr. Warren. I can't just—" "5 minutes," Warren said, and there was something in his voice that had closed billion-dollar deals, though now it was tempered with kindness. "I think 5 minutes won't hurt." She hesitated, then nodded, untying her apron with careful fingers. They walked together to his booth, and Warren couldn't help but notice how she moved, still with grace, but with the careful steps of someone whose body had carried her through 8 decades of life. They sat across from each other, the morning, light catching the silver in Maria's hair and the concern in Warren's eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of years hung between them, filled with all the conversations they'd never had, all the assumptions that had gone unexamined. "Tell me," Warren said finally, his voice gentle. "Tell me about your life. What happened after you left us?" Maria's hands folded in her lap, and Warren noticed they were still as careful and precise as they had been when she arranged flowers in his wife's favorite vase or set the table for important dinner guests. "Life happened, Mr. Warren. My husband got sick, cancer, the medical bills. Well, you know how those things go. We used up our savings, then some. After he passed, I found I needed to keep working." Warren listened, each word landing with the weight of recognition. Here was a story he had heard in boardrooms and financial reports, but somehow it felt different when it was attached to someone he knew, someone who had been part of his family's daily life. "I'm sorry about your husband," he said. "Roberto was a good man." Maria's eyes brightened slightly. "You remember him." "I remember the way he looked at you when he picked you up after work, like you were the most precious thing in the world." A tear tracked down Maria's cheek, and she wiped it away with the same dignity she brought to everything else. "He was my world, Mr. Warren, 54 years together. When he was gone, well, I found out how much the world costs when you're facing it alone." Warren felt something heavy settle in his stomach. This was Maria Santos, who had made sure his children had clean clothes and warm meals when he was traveling for business. This was the woman who had stayed late when his wife was feeling overwhelmed, who had brought homemade soup when anyone in the family was sick. This was someone who had cared for his family as if they were her own, and now she was working at 82 because life had demanded more from her than she had to give. "What about your children?" Warren asked. "Your daughter became a nurse, didn't she?" Maria nodded. "Elena, she's wonderful, has her own family now. 3 kids, a good husband. But they're struggling too, you know. Houses cost so much more now, and the kids need things for school. I don't want to be a burden." Warren's jaw tightened, not with anger but with a deep sense of something being profoundly wrong. The arithmetic of it didn't work. Not the financial arithmetic, but the human arithmetic. A woman who had given so much should not have to work at 82. A family that worked hard and played by the rules should not have to choose between caring for their children and caring for their aging mother. "Maria," he said, and his voice carried a weight that she recognized from the old days, when he was making the kinds of decisions that would change everything. "Do you remember what you used to tell me when I was stressed about an investment?" She smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her since she had turned around at the counter. "I used to tell you that worrying was like paying interest on trouble that might never come." "That's right. And you also used to tell me that the best investments were the ones that made the world a little better." Maria nodded, remembering. "You were always trying to do right by people, Mr. Warren. Even then, when you were just starting out." Warren leaned forward slightly, his hands flat on the table. "Maria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. If you didn't have to work, if money wasn't a concern, what would you do with your time?" She looked at him with confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you could wake up tomorrow and not worry about paying bills or medical expenses or any of that, what would you do?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. I suppose I'd spend more time with my grandchildren. Maybe volunteer at the church, help with the food bank." I always wanted to learn to paint. Watercolors. You know? And there's a lady down the hall from me, Mrs. Patterson. She's 93 and all alone. I'd like to spend more time with her, maybe play cards or just talk. Warren nodded slowly. This was the Maria he remembered. Always thinking about others, always finding ways to care for the people around her. The idea that she was spending her golden years worried about money instead of painting watercolors and helping lonely neighbors struck him as not just unfortunate, but actively wrong. "Maria," he said, "I want to tell you something. When you worked for us, you weren't just an employee. You were part of our family. You took care of us when we needed it most, and family takes care of family." She shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Warren, if you're thinking of offering me money, I can't—" "I'm not offering you money," Warren interrupted gently. "I'm talking about something bigger than that." He paused, and in that pause, Maria could see the Warren she remembered from 30 years ago. The man who thought carefully before speaking, who never made promises lightly, who understood that some decisions change everything. "Do you remember the Christmas bonus I gave you in 1987? He asked. Maria's brow furrowed. "The stock certificates? Mr. Warren, I told you then. I didn't understand all that. You kept them, didn't you?" "Well, yes, but—" "Maria, those weren't just any stock certificates. They were shares in Berkshire Hathaway. And I'm about to tell you something that might change your life." Warren pulled out his phone, opened a financial app, and showed her the screen. Maria squinted at the numbers, then looked up at him with confusion. "I don't understand, Mr. Warren. What am I looking at?" "You're looking at what those 50 shares I gave you for Christmas in 1987 are worth today." Maria stared at the screen. The number didn't make sense. It was too big, too impossible. She blinked, looked again, then looked at Warren with something approaching panic. "This can't be right," she whispered. "It's exactly right. Maria, you've been wealthy for decades. You just didn't know it." The diner continued its morning routine around them. But Maria Santos sat in complete stillness, staring at a number that represented more money than she had ever imagined having. More money than her husband's medical bills, more money than her daughter's mortgage, more money than she could spend in several lifetimes. But I don't understand," she stammered. "I checked on those once, years ago, and they said they were worth maybe a few $1,000s. "When did you check?" Warren asked gently. "It must have been, maybe 15 years ago, when Roberto first got sick. The broker said they weren't worth much, that I should just hold on to them." Warren closed his eyes briefly. 15 years ago, those shares would have been worth perhaps $100,000, a significant sum, but not life-changing. Today, with splits and growth and the magic of compound interest over decades, they represented something entirely different. "Maria," he said, 15 years ago, that broker was right. But the thing about good investments is that they grow. Those shares have been growing for 37 years. She stared at the phone screen again, then at Warren, then back at the screen. "This number, it says $3.2 million. Warren finished for her. "As of yesterday's close." Maria's hands began to shake. The coffee cup in front of her rattled against its saucer. Around them, the normal sounds of the diner continued, the clink of silverware, the low hum of conversation, the morning news playing on the small television above the counter. But for Maria Santos, the world had just shifted on its axis. I can't, she began, then stopped. "Mr. Warren, are you sure? Are you absolutely sure?" Warren nodded. "I'm sure. But Maria, there's something else. Something I need to tell you about why I gave you those shares in the first place." She looked at him through eyes that were now bright with tears, tears of relief, of disbelief, of 30 years of worry suddenly lifting like fog in the morning sun. "In 1987, Warren continued, my wife Susan was going through a difficult time. You remember, She was sad that winter, struggling with some personal things, and you saw what the rest of us missed. You saw that she needed more than just practical help. You saw that she needed someone to care about her as a person. Maria nodded slowly. Mrs. Susan was hurting. Anyone could see that. Not anyone, Maria. I was so focused on work, on deals and investments and the business of business that I almost missed what was happening in my own home. But you didn't miss it. You made sure she ate when she wouldn't come to the table. You sat with her when she couldn't sleep. You listened when she needed to talk. You didn't just clean our house, Maria. You helped hold our family together. Warren's voice grew quieter, more reflective. That Christmas, when I gave you those shares, it wasn't just a bonus. It was my way of saying that what you had given us couldn't be measured in hours worked or tasks completed. It was an investment in the person who had invested in our family when we needed it most. Maria wiped her eyes with a napkin, her composure beginning to crack. I was just doing my job, Mr. Warren. No, Warren said firmly. You were doing something much more important than a job. You were practicing love. The words hung between them, simple and profound. Around them, the diner carried on with its everyday business. But this moment, this recognition, this revelation, existed in its own pocket of time. But why didn't you tell me? Maria asked. All these years, why didn't you let me know? Warren was quiet for a moment, considering. Honestly, because I thought you knew. I thought you were checking on them regularly, watching them grow. And then, well, life got busy. The company grew. Things got complicated. I assumed you were being taken care of by your investment. He paused, looking down at his hands. I should have checked on you personally. I should have made sure you understood what you had. That's on me, Maria. That's my failure. Maria reached across the table and placed her weathered hand over his. Mr. Warren, you don't owe me anything. You've already given me more than I ever dreamed of. But you've been working all these years when you didn't need to. You've been worrying about money when you had enough to take care of yourself and your family for generations. That's not right. Warren looked around the diner, at the other customers starting their day, at the hard-working staff behind the counter. Maria, what are you going to do now that you know? She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands, at the phone screen that still showed that impossible number, at this man who had just changed her life with information she had owned for decades without knowing it. I don't know, she said finally. I honestly don't know. This morning I woke up worried about my electric bill. Now you're telling me. She trailed off, shaking her head. Take your time, Warren said. There's no rush. The money isn't going anywhere. But Maria, I want you to promise me something. She looked up at him. Promise me you'll call your daughter today. Tell her what's happened. Tell her that her mother doesn't need to work anymore, that she can be a grandmother instead of a waitress. Tell her that sometimes the world surprises us with gifts we didn't know we had. Maria nodded, tears flowing freely now. I will. I'll call Elena as soon as my shift ends. Your shift ends now, Warren said gently. What? Warren stood up and walked to the counter where the manager was watching their conversation with curiosity. Excuse me, he said. I'm Warren Buffett. Maria Santos has just received some important news about her financial situation. She's going to need to leave work today to take care of some personal business. The manager, a tired-looking man in his 50s, glanced from Warren to Maria and back again. Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but Maria has a job to do. Warren pulled out his wallet and placed $500 on the counter. This should cover her wages for the rest of the week. She won't be coming back. The manager stared at the money, then at Warren, recognition beginning to dawn. You're really him, Warren Buffett. I am. And Maria Santos is my friend. She's done her last day of work she doesn't want to do. Warren returned to the booth where Maria sat, still staring at the phone screen as if it might disappear. "Maria, I want you to come with me. We're going to go see my financial advisor, and we're going to make sure you understand exactly what you have and how to manage it. And then, if you want, we're going to call your daughter together." She looked up at him, this man who had just handed her a new life, and nodded. "Mr. Warren, I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," he said, 37 years ago, when you took care of my family. This is just compound interest on kindness." They left the diner together, walking out into the bright morning sunshine. Warren's car was parked at the curb, not the luxury vehicle people might expect, but a practical sedan that had seen better years. As he opened the passenger door for Maria, she paused. "Mr. Warren, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you come to that diner this morning? I mean, really, was it just coincidence?" Warren considered the question. "You know, Maria, I've been going to that diner for years. Never saw you there before today. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe..." He trailed off, then smiled. Maybe the universe has a sense of timing. As they drove through the familiar streets of Omaha, Maria watched the city she had known all her life pass by the window. Everything looked the same, but somehow everything had changed. The houses, the shops, the people walking to work, they all existed in a world where Maria Santos was no longer worried about money, where she could paint watercolors and visit lonely neighbors and spoil her grandchildren. "Mr. Warren," she said as they pulled into the parking lot of his office building, "what am I supposed to do with all this money?" Warren turned off the engine and looked at her. "Maria, let me tell you something I learned a long time ago. Money is just a tool. The question isn't what you're supposed to do with it. The question is, who do you want to be with it?" Inside the building, Warren's financial advisor, a sharp woman named Patricia, who had been managing wealth for 30 years, spread papers across a conference table and explained to Maria exactly what she owned. The shares had split multiple times over the decades. Dividends had been reinvested. The magic of compound interest had worked its quiet miracle year after year, year after year. "Mrs. Santos," Patricia said gently, "you're what we call a high net worth individual. With proper management, this money will provide for you and your family for generations." Maria listened to the explanations, asked careful questions, signed papers that made her newfound wealth official. But through it all, she kept glancing at Warren, who sat quietly beside her, occasionally offering clarification or reassurance. When the paperwork was done, Warren walked Maria to a quiet corner of the office. "There's something else I want to discuss with you," he said. "Something I've been thinking about since we left the diner." Maria settled into a comfortable chair, still looking slightly dazed by the morning's revelations. "Maria, you spent decades taking care of other people. My family, your husband, your daughter, your grandchildren. You've earned the right to be taken care of now, but I know you, and I know that's not going to be enough for you. You're going to want to do something meaningful with this gift." She nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor, and all the other people like her, people who are alone, who need someone to care about them." "Tell me about Mrs. Patterson." Maria's face softened. "She's 93, Mr. Warren. Her family lives far away, and she hardly ever sees them. Most days, I think I'm the only person she talks to. There are so many people like her in our building, in our neighborhood. People who worked hard all their lives, and now they're just forgotten." Warren leaned forward. "What would you do if you could do anything?" "I'd want to help them," Maria said without hesitation. "Not just with money, but with companionship, with dignity. I'd want to make sure they know someone cares about them." Warren smiled. "Maria, what would you think about starting a foundation? Something that focuses on providing companionship and support for elderly people who are isolated. Something that treats them not as charity cases, but as valued members of the community." Maria's eyes widened. A foundation? Mr. Warren, I don't know anything about running a foundation. You know the most important thing, Warren replied. You know how to care about people. The rest can be learned. Over the next hour, Warren and Patricia outlined what such a foundation might look like. They talked about hiring caregivers who would provide not just practical help, but genuine companionship. They discussed programs that would connect isolated seniors with volunteer visitors, that would provide transportation to social events, that would ensure no one spent holidays alone. We could call it the Santos Foundation, Warren suggested. Maria shook her head. No, Mr. Warren, if we're going to do this, it should be something that honors all the people it serves. What about the Neighbor Foundation? Because that's what we all should be to each other. Good neighbors. Warren nodded approvingly. The Neighbor Foundation. I like that. As the afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, they continued planning. Warren offered to provide additional funding and to help with the organizational structure. Patricia discussed the legal requirements and tax implications. But mostly, they talked about the elderly people in their community who would benefit from knowing that someone cared about their well-being. Maria, Warren said as they prepared to leave, I want to tell you something. This morning, when I walked into that diner and saw you behind the counter, I felt like I had failed you, like I had let down someone who had been important to my family. Mr. Warren, let me finish, he said gently. But now, sitting here watching you plan how to use this gift to help other people, I realize I was wrong. You don't need me to take care of you. You never did. You just needed the tools to take care of others the way you've always wanted to. Maria was quiet for a moment, then smiled. My Roberto used to say that we're all just walking each other home. That's all any of us can do, help each other get where we're going. Warren felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness that he recognized from his best investment decisions. This was how money was supposed to work, not just growing for its own sake, but growing so it could be used to make life better for real people with real needs. Maria, there's one more thing I want to ask you. What's that, Mr. Warren? Would you consider letting me be the first volunteer for the Neighbor Foundation? I think I'd like to learn how to be a better neighbor myself. Maria laughed, the first truly joyful sound Warren had heard from her all day. Mr. Warren, you've been a good neighbor to me for 37 years. I think you might just be a natural at it. 3 months later, Warren returned to Goodman's diner for breakfast. The morning routine was the same, the golden light through the windows, the familiar sounds of a working kitchen, the comforting atmosphere of people starting their day. But there was a new addition to the scene. A small framed photograph on the wall near the counter. It showed Maria Santos cutting the ribbon at the grand opening of the Neighbor Foundation's first community center. She was surrounded by elderly residents from the area, all of them smiling, all of them looking like they belonged somewhere important. Warren was in the photograph too, standing slightly to the side, applauding. Quite a story, isn't it? Said Jenny, the waitress, as she poured Warren's coffee. About Mrs. Santos, I mean. Who would have thought she was rich all along? Warren smiled, unfolding his newspaper. Sometimes the best investments are the ones you forget you made. She comes in here once a week now, you know, always with some of the folks from the foundation. They have breakfast together like a family. She looks so happy. Warren nodded, thinking about the weekly reports he received from the foundation. In 3 months, they had provided companionship services to over 200 elderly residents. They had started a weekly lunch program, a transportation service for medical appointments, and a telephone check-in system for people who lived alone. Most importantly, they had created a community where being old didn't mean being forgotten. Mr. Buffett? Jenny interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Santos left something for you, in case you came in. She handed him an envelope with his name written. In Maria's careful handwriting, Inside was a watercolor painting, not professional but full of heart. It showed the view from Maria's apartment window, the tree-lined street, the small houses with their tidy gardens, the neighborhood where she had lived for decades. At the bottom, in pencil, she had written, "Thank you for helping me see that home was always beautiful. I just needed time to paint it." Warren stared at the painting for a long time, thinking about compound interest and the strange mathematics of kindness. 37 years ago, he had given Maria 50 shares of stock as a Christmas bonus. He had thought he was being generous, giving her something that might be worth a few $1,000s someday. He had never imagined that those shares would grow into millions. But more than that, he had never imagined that they would grow into something even more valuable. A foundation that turned loneliness into community, isolation into connection, forgotten lives into lives that mattered. The morning customers came and went around him, each carrying their own stories, their own hopes, their own hidden investments in the future. Warren finished his breakfast, left a generous tip, and carefully tucked Maria's painting into his briefcase. As he walked to his car, he thought about the phone call he would make that afternoon to Maria, to check on the foundation's progress, and to schedule his next volunteer shift. At 82, he was learning that the best returns weren't always measured in dollars and cents, but in the warmth of human connection and the satisfaction of problems solved. He had spent a lifetime teaching people about the magic of compound interest, about how small investments could grow into great wealth over time. But Maria Santos had taught him something even more valuable, that the greatest returns come from investments made in people, and that kindness, like money, grows most beautifully when it's shared. Warren drove through the familiar streets of Omaha, past the houses and shops and offices where ordinary people were making their own quiet investments in the future. Some would yield financial returns, others would yield something even more precious. But all of them, in their own way, were part of the same great equation that governed both money and life. What you plant today determines what you harvest tomorrow. At a red light, he glanced at Maria's painting on the passenger seat. The watercolors had captured something that no financial statement ever could: the simple beauty of a life well lived, of a neighborhood where people knew each other's names, of a world where 82-year-old women could discover they were wealthy in ways they never imagined. The light turned green, and Warren drove on, carrying with him the quiet satisfaction of an investor who had finally seen his best decision pay its greatest dividend. 6 months after that morning at Goodman's Diner, the Neighbor Foundation had become something neither Warren nor Maria could have fully envisioned. What had started as a simple idea, providing companionship to isolated elderly people, had grown into a network of care that touched every corner of their community. Warren found himself thinking about this transformation as he sat in the foundation's main office, reviewing the quarterly report. The numbers told a story that would have impressed any investor. 847 elderly residents now received regular visits. 23 people had been moved from dangerous living conditions into safe housing, and the Foundation's telephone check-in service had prevented 4 medical emergencies by ensuring someone cared enough to notice when daily calls went unanswered. But the numbers, impressive as they were, couldn't capture what Warren saw when he made his weekly volunteer visits. They couldn't measure the way 89-year-old Harold Patterson's face lit up when someone remembered that he had been a jazz pianist in his youth. They couldn't quantify the value of teaching 94-year-old Rose Chen to video call her great-grandchildren in California, or the joy in her voice when she realized she could see them grow up despite the distance. "Mr. Warren?" Maria's voice interrupted his thoughts. She had taken to calling him that again, despite his protests that they were partners now, equals in this endeavor. "There's someone I'd like you to meet. She led him to the foundation's community room, where a woman in her 70s sat at a small table, carefully arranging flowers in a vase. Her movements were precise, artistic, and Warren could see immediately that this was someone who understood beauty. "This is Dorothy Henley," Maria said. "She worked as a seamstress for 40 years before her arthritis got too bad. Dorothy, this is Warren Buffett, the gentleman I told you about." Dorothy looked up with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and humor. "Oh, the famous investor," she said with a slight smile. "Maria tells me you're learning to be a volunteer." Warren chuckled. "I'm trying, though I think I'm better with numbers than I am with people sometimes." "Numbers are easy," Dorothy replied, returning to her flower arrangement. "They always do what you expect. People are more interesting." Warren found himself drawn into conversation with Dorothy, learning that she had been living alone for 8 years since her husband died, that her children lived in other states, that she had been slowly withdrawing from the world until Maria's foundation reached out to her. "The hardest part," Dorothy explained, "wasn't being alone. It was feeling invisible, like I didn't matter anymore because I couldn't contribute anything." She gestured to the flowers she was arranging. "Now I do the flower arrangements for all. The community events. It's not much, but it's something. It's a way of making things beautiful for other people." Warren watched her work, struck by the care she put into each placement, the way her arthritic hands moved with practiced grace despite their limitations. "Dorothy, those arrangements aren't not much. They're what make this place feel like home instead of an institution." Over the following weeks, Warren found himself thinking more and more about Dorothy's words about feeling invisible. It reminded him of something he had observed in the business world, how easy it was to overlook the value that didn't show up in quarterly reports, the contributions that couldn't be measured in spreadsheets. He began to understand that the Neighbor Foundation was addressing something deeper than loneliness. It was addressing a crisis of purpose, a sense that aging meant becoming irrelevant. The foundation wasn't just providing services to elderly people, it was creating opportunities for them to remain valuable, contributing members of their community. This realization led to the foundation's next innovation, the Wisdom Project. Warren and Maria developed a program that paired elderly community members with local high school students, not for traditional tutoring, but for mutual learning. The elderly participants shared life skills, historical perspectives, and practical wisdom, while the students helped with technology, shared contemporary viewpoints, and provided energy and enthusiasm. The first session took place on a crisp October morning in the Foundation's main community room. Warren arrived early, partly to observe and partly because he had volunteered to participate himself. He found himself paired with a 17-year-old named Marcus, whose grandmother had been one of the Foundation's first clients. "So," Marcus said, settling into a chair across from Warren, "my grandma says you're some kind of big deal in the money world." Warren smiled. "I try to understand how money works, but I suspect you might know things about the world that I don't." "Like what?" "Like what it's like to grow up with the internet. Like how your generation thinks about work and life balance. Like what you think is important." What followed was one of the most enlightening conversations Warren had experienced in years. Marcus talked about his concerns for the environment, his frustration with economic inequality, his dreams of starting a business that could make a difference in the world. Warren found himself sharing stories from his early days as an investor, the mistakes he had made, the lessons he had learned about the relationship between money and meaning. "You know what's funny?" Marcus said toward the end of their session. "I always thought rich people were just greedy. But talking to you, it's like money is just a tool you use to solve problems." "That's exactly what it is," Warren replied. "The question is what problems you choose to solve." Around them, similar conversations were taking place between other pairs. Dorothy Henley was teaching a young woman named Sarah how to hand-stitch a buttonhole, while Sarah showed Dorothy how to use Instagram to share photos of her flower arrangements. Harold Patterson was explaining jazz improvisation to a teenager who played guitar, while the teenager introduced Harold to modern music, software that could help him compose again. Maria moved through the room like a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of connection. Warren watched her pause at each pair, offering encouragement, asking thoughtful questions, making sure everyone felt heard and valued. She had transformed from someone who worried about paying her electric bill into someone who was changing, lives on a daily basis. Quite a change from serving coffee and donuts, Warren said when Maria joined him at the end of the session. Is it, though? Maria replied thoughtfully. I think I've always been in the business of taking care of people. Now I just have better tools to do it with. As autumn deepened into winter, the foundation continued to grow. They opened a second location in a neighboring community. They partnered with the local hospital to provide companionship services for elderly patients. They started a program that helped isolated seniors learn to use technology to stay connected with distant family members. But perhaps most importantly, they began to change the conversation about aging in their community. Instead of being seen as a burden or a problem to be managed, elderly residents were increasingly recognized as resources, as holders of wisdom and experience that could benefit everyone. Warren found his own perspective shifting as well. His volunteer work at the foundation had become as important to him as his business activities. He began to understand that his reputation as a successful investor was less meaningful than his growing reputation as someone who genuinely cared about the well-being of his neighbors. On a cold December morning, almost a year after that fateful encounter at Goodman's Diner, Warren received a phone call that would test everything the foundation had built. Mr. Buffett? The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, professional. This is Dr. Jennifer Walsh from Mercy Hospital. I'm calling about Maria Santos. Warren's blood went cold. Is she all right? She's stable now, but she had a heart attack yesterday evening. She's been asking for you. Warren was at the hospital within 20 minutes, his usual careful driving abandoned in favor of speed. He found Maria in a private room, connected to monitors, but awake and alert. Her daughter Elena was beside her, holding her hand. Mr. Warren, Maria said softly when she saw him. You came. Of course I came, Warren replied, pulling up a chair beside her bed. How are you feeling? Tired, she admitted, but grateful. The doctors say it was mild, that I should recover completely. Eleanor looked up at Warren with tears in her eyes. Mr. Buffett, I can't thank you enough for what you've done for my mother. Not just the money, though that's been incredible, but giving her a purpose again. The foundation has made her so happy. Warren patted Eleanor's shoulder gently. Your mother didn't need me to give her purpose. She's always had that. I just helped her find the resources to express it. Over the next few days, as Maria recovered in the hospital, Warren found himself thinking about mortality, about legacy, about what mattered most when life reminded you of its finite nature. He spent more time at the foundation, helping to manage the daily operations that Maria usually oversaw, and he was struck by how much the organization had come to depend on her wisdom and guidance. We need to make sure this continues beyond any one person, Warren told Patricia, his financial advisor, during one of their regular meetings. The foundation can't be dependent on Maria's personal involvement, no matter how valuable that is. They spent the following weeks developing a more robust organizational structure, hiring additional staff, creating systems that would ensure the foundation's work could continue and grow regardless of any individual circumstances. But even as they planned for sustainability, Warren knew that Maria's heart and vision would always be the foundation's true driving force. When Maria was released from the hospital, The foundation's community room was decorated with flowers, Dorothy's arrangements, of course, and filled with the people whose lives she had touched. Harold Patterson played jazz on an old piano someone had donated. Marcus and several other teenagers from the Wisdom Project had prepared a presentation about what they had learned from their elderly mentors. "Speech!" someone called out, and others took up the chant. Maria stood slowly, still weak from her hospitalization, but smiling with the joy of being surrounded by people she loved. "I'm not good at speeches," she began, "but I want to tell you all something." The room quieted. "A year ago, I was afraid of being poor, afraid of being a burden, afraid of growing old without dignity. I thought my life was almost over, that I had nothing left to contribute." She paused, looking around the room at the faces watching her, young and old, volunteers and clients, people who had become a community because they had chosen to care about each other. "But I learned something this year. I learned that wealth isn't just about money, it's about having enough to share. And when we share what we have, our time, our skills, our care for each other, we all become wealthy." Warren felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was Maria Santos, who had started the year worried about her electric bill and afraid of being a burden, now talking about wealth in terms that no business school had ever taught. "The foundation isn't my foundation," Maria continued. "It's our foundation. It belongs to everyone who has chosen to be a good neighbor. And as long as there are people willing to care about each other, it will continue to grow." The applause was warm and sustained, but Warren barely heard it. He was thinking about compound interest again, but not the kind that accumulated in bank accounts. He was thinking about the compound interest of kindness, the way one act of care multiplied into many, the way an investment in human dignity paid dividends across generations. As the celebration continued around him, Warren found himself in conversation with Eleanor, Maria's daughter, who had become deeply involved in the foundation's work. "Mr. Buffett," she said, "I wanted to ask you something. Mom's told me the story of how this all started, how you found her working at the diner. But I keep wondering, what if you hadn't gone to that diner that morning? What if you hadn't recognized her?" Warren considered the question. "You know, Elena, I used to think that morning was a coincidence, but I don't think that anymore." "What do you think it was?" "I think it was the universe reminding me what I already knew but had forgotten, that the most important investments are the ones we make in each other." Later that evening, after the celebration had ended and the community room had been cleaned, Warren and Maria sat together in the quiet space, surrounded by Dorothy's flower arrangements and the comfortable furniture that had been donated by various community members. "Maria," Warren said, "I have a confession to make." She looked at him with curiosity. "When I first saw you at that diner, I felt guilty. I thought I had failed you, that I should have stayed in better touch, should have made sure you were taken care of." "Mr. Warren, let me finish," he said gently. "But now I realize I was thinking about it all wrong. You didn't need me to take care of you. What happened was much better than that. We took care of each other." Maria smiled. "My Roberto used to say that the best relationships aren't about one person saving another. They're about two people helping each other become who they were meant to be. Smart man, your Roberto. He was. And he would have loved seeing this, all these people choosing to be family to each other." Warren nodded, looking around the room, where so many meaningful connections had been forged. "Maria, I want to ask you something. If you could go back to that morning at the diner, knowing everything that was going to happen, would you change anything?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, considering. "You know what I think, Mr. Warren? I think everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. I needed to work at that diner to understand what it felt like to worry about money when you're Too old to start over, because without that experience, I never would have understood what other people in that situation were going through. She paused, smiling. Sometimes the best gifts come disguised as problems, and sometimes the best problems come disguised as gifts. Warren felt something settle in his chest, a sense of completion that he recognized from his most successful business ventures. But this was different, deeper, more personal, more meaningful than any financial transaction could ever be. "Maria," he said, "I want you to know something. In all my years of investing, in all the companies I've bought and sold, all the fortunes I've watched grow and shrink, this foundation, what we've built together, this is the investment I'm most proud of, even though the returns can't be measured in dollars, especially because the returns can't be measured in dollars." As they prepared to leave that evening, Warren helped Maria with her coat, a small gesture that reminded them both of their long relationship, of all the ways they had cared for each other across the decades. Outside, the December air was crisp and clear, and the streetlights illuminated the snow that had begun to fall. They stood for a moment, two old friends looking at the building that housed their shared dream, watching the snow accumulate on the windows of the community room where so much love and connection had been fostered. "Mr. Warren," Maria said, "do you think we've changed the world?" Warren considered the question, thinking about all the lives that had been touched by the Foundation's work, all the loneliness that had been transformed into community, all the fear that had been replaced with dignity and purpose. "I think we've changed our corner of it," he said finally, "and maybe that's how the whole world gets changed, one corner at a time, by people who choose to be good neighbors." They walked to their cars together, their footsteps creating the first tracks in the fresh snow. As Warren drove home through the quiet streets of Omaha, he thought about the strange mathematics of a life well lived, the way investments in human kindness seemed to grow without limit, paying dividends that enriched not just the investor, but everyone they touched. In his rearview mirror, he could see the warm lights of the Neighbor Foundation building growing, smaller but not dimmer, a beacon of hope in a world that too often forgot the value of simply caring about each other. Tomorrow, there would be more elderly people who needed companionship, more young people who could benefit from wisdom, more opportunities to prove that wealth was not just about having enough for yourself, but about having enough to share. Warren Buffett, who had spent a lifetime teaching people about the power of compound interest, drove through the snowy night with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally learned its most important lesson. The greatest returns come from investments that cannot be measured, only felt, in the warmth of human connection and the enduring power of love multiplied across time. Some investments don't show returns on paper, only in people. If this story stirred something deep in you, a memory, a reflection, or just a quiet feeling, please like this video and subscribe to Panorama Legacy. Every click helps us share stories that speak softly, but stay with you long after they're told. Tell us in the comments what moment in this story moved you the most, or simply share where you're watching from. We'd love to know. And if you're ready for another story that reveals the quiet power of kindness, click on the next video now, because sometimes what truly changes the world is one silent act of recognition.